first person we're going to hear from this morning is Hartmut Fünfgeld, who is a key contributor to the Adaptation Toolkit. Hartmut has a PhD in Human Geography from the University of Heidelberg in Germany, and he's a Senior Research Fellow at RMIT University. His research focuses on approaches to frameworks for local and regional climate change adaptation, including how community service organisations and natural resource management bodies adapt to climate change. His experience includes working on climate change and sustainability issues in local government and communities in Australia, Europe, Africa and Asia. Please welcome Hartmut.
Thanks very much, Jane, and thanks to all of you for making an effort to come here tomorrow and for your interest in this type of work. My role here is to give you, I guess, a bit of what I would call a perspective on the sectoral context in which this toolkit was developed in the local government sector, what climate change adaptation is up to and where we're headed maybe with the help of toolkits such as this one. And I keep this fairly short and brief, and I don't have any PowerPoint or anything. I just wanted to have a bit of a chat, basically, and some of it is just my personal reflection on having worked in this sort of area for the last few years. So I guess it's not news to anyone in this room that alongside reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're now in a situation where, unfortunately, we also need to think about climate change impacts, and we need to do something about them. We need to respond to them when they occur. We need to plan ahead. Not only in the short term, but also looking at a much longer term perspective that many of the organizations we work for would traditionally probably plan for, and that applies also to local government. And if we look at what's happened in the local government sector in terms of climate change adaptation in the last maybe 5 years, since 2007, 6, 7 roughly, I think we can firmly say there's been a strong emphasis on climate risk management. And many of you would, would have seen or used or read this publication. Some people call it the Blue Bible, Climate Change Risk Management, Climate Change Impacts and Risk Management: A Guide for Business and Government, published in 2006 by the Australian Greenhouse Office. And I actually think, as much as this document is often criticised, and I'm one of them who often has a critical voice about them, it's actually, when it came out, it was one of the first guides of this kind published by a government worldwide, and it was actually really, really groundbreaking in many ways. And I think it's generated a lot of the work that we're seeing today. So I think it's really positive, and that sort of focus on risk assessment, which this is really a guide for, was also picked up internationally, and developments happen in other countries in parallel that also emphasize climate risk assessment. And there's publications such as this one, the Climate Change in Cities First Assessment Report. So this is again a risk assessment type thing that looks at how climate change impacts affect cities, and in that context then also local governments. So this guide, and a lot of what's happened since the publication of this guide has meant that climate change impacts increasingly at an organizational level, certainly in the local government sector and also elsewhere, were looked at from a risk management perspective. And that was, I think, a very good way of looking at it, because it connects very well with existing organizational processes. It also connects quite well with concerns around the legal liability of climate change impacts, and we've certainly seen a lot of that discussion around legal issues and duty of care in the context of sea level rise and land use planning. And a lot of risk assessments have been conducted around the country, a lot of them funded by federal government and other types of government. And that's sort of all connected to this sort of what I'd call the first phase of climate change adaptation planning in the local government sector. What I think this toolkit hopefully is a part of is sort of the entering of a second phase that we're sort of now starting to see, which sort of acknowledges that doing a risk assessment is one thing, and it's an important step in the process of adapting to climate change, but what do you do after that? And I think we can probably also say that there's a number of organizations around the countries that have done a risk assessment which sits on a shelf, or which they're not quite sure what to do with in terms of what next and how to actually respond to the risks that they identified. And in fact, I'm aware of some organizations that are quite terrified about taking the risk assessment off the shelf and saying, well, these are all the risks we've identified, now we have to do something about them. So toolkits come and go in phases, and I think this one starts off where the risk assessment ends. One of the inputs into these toolkits, and Susie and Fiona will talk about that in more detail, is that the idea that you have already identified priority climate change risks. You've identified some and you've prioritized some. But then what do you do with them? How do you then move on from a process of identifying them to actually coming up with sensible actions that work across an organization? How do you integrate this type of work with organizational processes? And sometimes this process of integration is referred to as mainstreaming, as you probably all know. And it's quite surprising when you look around the literature, there's actually not a lot of evidence of how to do mainstreaming in a developed country context. A lot of the information we're finding about mainstreaming of adaptation is actually coming from developing countries. And it's very much about mainstreaming or integrating climate change considerations into development planning, international development type work. And I think we can actually learn a lot from that. But I think this toolkit I would call cutting edge, and it's always easy to say that when you've been involved in it yourself. But I think it is really, in many ways, a next step. And I would encourage you to have a look and let us know what you think about it after the launch today, because it helps people to explore identified climate change risks further and go through a structured process of then identifying adaptation options, and doing this in the context of working with various types of uncertainty. Because we've realized, and lots of you would have realized in your day-to-day work, that uncertainty is one of the key issues that we have to somehow deal with in this context. And it's not easy, it's not straightforward. It's a complex, messy sort of situation. I won't go into the details what the toolkit actually does, because that's Susie and Fiona's presentation. And also, this toolkit has a story to it. The story of actually having it developed within an organizational context, which is that of the City of Greater Geelong. And Burke from the City of Greater Geelong will tell you a little bit about that story and how that evolved. But one thing I can certainly say is one of the things that hopefully come out in the document as well, but that we've experienced, or I've experienced working on this project. It's been a fantastic process of respectful and true collaboration between a consulting firm, or in this case the foundation arm of a consulting firm on the one hand, a local council on the other hand, and then an academic institution that I belong to. And I think, when I went into this, I was sort of asked, how do you want to be part of this? And I said, it sounds interesting. It's going to be a bit of an experiment, like working with a council and a consulting firm. I've always worked with the council or a consulting firm, but never with both of them at the same time. And I think it went really well. And it's been a fantastic experience. And I strongly encourage, to think about these sorts of arrangements where you get people with quite different skill sets together and force them to spend time together and work it out. And I think we certainly did that. We had a lot of lengthy discussion and a lot of productive work together. And the other aspect of the toolkit I think needs to be emphasized is the fact that it is grounded in practice. So we've done quite a bit of testing internally in the City of Greater Geelong, and Burke will talk about that. And we've also tried to include as many examples as possible in the toolkit, which you'll hear about as well. So, I think this is sort of this second generation of toolkits, post-risk assessment toolkits, is very useful. Sometimes we use these terms toolkit, and we had a debate about that. And what does that actually mean? What is a toolkit? What's a guide? What are these terms? Really, in many ways, when you look at the tools that are contained in this document, it's very much about a process or a sequence of processes. That's what it is. The idea of the toolkit is that you can actually combine these. You can pick one standalone tool, or you can work with the whole sequence of them. But really, it's about processes. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I'm excited to see this being launched. I'm excited and looking forward to feedback that we can get from people that haven't been involved. And seeing that we live in an age of toolkits and self-help guides and whatnot, I actually thought about, I thought I'd end on a quotation, on a citation that some years ago an elderly, I shouldn't say elderly, an older relative of mine, it's actually my father-in-law, but I shouldn't say that, recommended a book for me to read, which is called The Road Less Travelled. I'm not sure if anyone knows. It was one of the first sort of big self-help sort of psychology guides, and published in something like '79, way before the time I could read anyway. But and I'm not going to tell you what I think about this book, but there is a quote that stuck in my mind, which was about the complexity of life, of our modern lives. And that quote, I'm doing something here which I really should probably never do in public, but I'm taking this quote, and I reread this quote the other day, and I thought, this is really interesting. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to replace the term life that Scott Peck, the author, uses with climate change adaptation. And just listen to this. So the quote goes, "Climate change adaptation is complex. Each one of us must make his own path through climate change adaptation. There are no self-help manuals." Yes, there is one. No formulas. No easy answers. The right road for one is the wrong road for another. The journey of climate change adaptation is not paved in blacktop. It is not brightly lit, and it has no road signs. It is a rocky path through the wilderness. And I think we have to acknowledge that, and we're trying to do that with this guide. And I'd like to thank all the collaborators on this project. It's been a fantastic time. Thank you.